Hey, folks, good evening. Good to have you here tonight. And just getting my lights on. There we go. Whoa. Hello. Hey, good to have you here. It's Tuesday night. I think it's Tuesday. Yes, it is. It's Tuesday night. And I'm glad you're here. And hope you had a good day. Had great time here today. I just want you to know, as we're getting started here at 9 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern, going to be going on with Rocky Stucci on the Rocky Stucci Situation Room. We have as our guest tonight Scott Walter from A&E's America Unearthed, and I guess A&E is now with the Travel Channel, and it's been 4 years since his show has been on the air. Although he has had he had a short run, eight episode mini series on the Templar Gold or something like that, of the Knights Treasure of the Knights Templar. And if you haven't seen his show, America Unearthed, go take a look. Scott actually lives here locally in the Twin Cities, in the outskirts of the western Minneapolis suburbs, and has a business here. And he started doing this show a few years back. And so I've met Scott personally. He's been at the Paradigm Symposium, interviewed him before, and he's going to be on with Rocky and I immediately following this reading tonight, which will stand at the Wednesday show out east. So be sure to tune in after this. And also, we have what else have I got going? Nothing in particular other than I was going to mention my website. Go to scottallenroberts.com. You can see all my junk there, read my articles, see my book, see my artwork. Hire me if you want to hire me to do art, design, logos, illustration, anything like that. It's what I do for a living. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to go through and just say hi to whoever's sitting here right now. And we got Brian Parker. Good to see you. Holly, nice to see you too. You say you're actually early this time. Well, that's good. I was actually right on time tonight. I'm usually coming in about a minute after the top of the hour. I like to be punctual, but doesn't always work that way. TT, good to see you. And Robin, I love you. I love the last name you've got. Macadang dang. Robin, good to see you. And Richie, Chasing Sommer, good to see you. And Rocky Stucci is in the room, so everyone shut up with a hashtag. Good to see you, Rocky, brother. And let's see, Chris Jones, aloha. And God, if you're in Hawaii, it is what? It's 4 p.m. or is it 3 p.m. in Hawaii right now? Nice to have you here in the middle of your afternoon. And let's see. What else we got? Nobody else to make general mention of so far. We've got more people in the chat room than we do viewing. So I just want to welcome everybody that's viewing out there. And let's get rolling on this. And this is, of course, tonight's chapter is chapter 10, and it's called Out of Egypt. And this is part of the Senenmut thread. So this is dealing with my guy and my candidate for Moses, who's always sitting there, of course, right over my shoulder, that little bust of Senenmut back there. And that was gifted to me by John Ward, as you all have heard me say a couple of times, out of a stone from Hatshepsut's quarry out there over by the Valley of the Kings. And he had a local artisan in Luxor carved that for me. Replica of a statue of Senenmut with the young princess. You can see her head just kind of bobbing up here right in front, the Princess Nefruri. And so that's my guy. That's who we're talking about tonight. We spent a couple of nights on Hapu, which was John's guy, Amenhotep, son of Hapu. And I will tell you this, John and I have a lot of respect for each other's theories. I have a lot of respect for John's research. I disagree with him on Moses, and that hence the book. We're presenting two different viewpoints. And if I hadn't mentioned this already, I probably did very early on, but it was interesting. I met John Ward back in, I want to say 2010 or 2011 via a group on Facebook. I saw he was making a post about something. being an archaeologist and Egyptologist and so on. And I connected with him over there and friended him, and we got to talking. And we got to talking about our theory. I said, I got to ask you, because you're an archaeologist and Egyptologist, what your theory on Moses is, if you even have one. And he said, oh, do I? And we got to talking, and we ended up communicating with each other almost every day as friends via Skype. He'd tune in his Skype over there. He'd sit on his rooftop, which was 3 stories up in his house. And you could see a big flat rooftop. He had rooftop gardens. It was immaculate up there. And you could see the Theban mountains, about a 10-minute drive away. But you could see the mountains over there. And so we'd sit and talk and have drinks and coffee and smokes and stuff like that. So Kirk, by the way, Macabre is over there. I tried to put him atop a bookshelf over on that side because I've got this tiny little bookshelf here. And I wanted the bust of Senenmut out. So Kirk got moved over there, and he's way up on top of a bookshelf over there, guardian, as it were. I used to have all my Star Trek action figures lined up high, about 7 feet off the floor, up on the tops of these bookshelves. So that's where he is. Let's see. So good to see you, Sterling, and Chris Jones. I saw you already. All right, let's move along, and let's get into this chapter. It's a slightly longer chapter. Not longer than anyone we've read so far, but it goes from let's see, we go to page 217 from 189. So 189 to 217, you're looking at 26 pages. And but right smack in the middle of that are our colored pages, the color section, but they're not numbered. So we're still at 26. And that color section in this book, as you know, looks like this. I got 2 color sections in this book. And you can see we've referred to some of the images here. Makes it a very fun, I think, a fun book to hold in your hands and look at stuff. There's John and I at Karnak. And then, of course, the first color section was way up here, dealing with other stuff, more John's Hapu stuff you can see there. So let's hit this chapter now. And I'll probably have a little more commentary on my own stuff than I had on John's stuff. It's just the way it is. So here we go. Let's see. Chapter 10, Out of Egypt. Part of the Senenmut thread. Driving across the Egyptian desert east of Cairo and the Nile Delta en route to the Sinai border was all at once beautiful and yet extremely boring. Not in a disinterested sort of way, but something like the feeling you get when driving through Iowa. Where the first few miles of flat cornfield are a beautiful thing to behold, but at about mile marker 99, you long to see a hill or a tree or a winding river. The Egyptian desert was a lot like that. Flat, sandy terrain as far as the eye could see, punctuated by the occasional dune or rocky outcrop. It made us think about how the journey must have been by foot. It took us a little more than 2 hours to reach the Suez Canal, and we were leaving the Cairo area. So from Cairo to the Suez Canal is about 2 hours on the highway. And the highway, by the way, almost sounds like a misnomer. It's a freeway, and people are doing 100 miles an hour out there, but it's a 2-lane highway straight across the flats of the desert. That's all there is. Not a lot of cars. A few trucks every now and then. So it took us a little more than 2 hours to reach the Suez Canal and the Sinai border, just to the north of the Red Sea. But if I had been asked to walk that distance, carrying everything I could take with me in a pack on my back, along with my wife, my parents, my small children, and my goats, sheep, and whatever else I could put my hands on while bugging out, that trip would have been much different and much longer. Then place my little entourage in a massive clustered line of almost 600,000 more groups of people, or 600,000 and more groups of people just like mine, and you can exponentially increase the walking time by a factor of impossible to nil. Then add to the equation that we are all slaves. or prisoners fleeing our overlords or masters, never quite sure if they'll be in hot pursuit or not. Add to that the lack of water and food, the hot sun beating down on us, the fact that none of us as slaves have ever been camping or know a damned thing about the desert wilderness survival techniques, and you have the making of an epic disaster. When Moses led those people out of Egypt, he had to have a plan. The biblical passage tells us that it was all divine, with God providing the way, as well as the miraculous defense and divinely provided food from the sky and water from the rock. It would take a heaping serving of faith to swallow that story whole. But that's precisely what the biblical story offers up on a golden calf shaped platter. So if this event truly took place, how are we to understand it in human terms? Sans the theophanized manipulation of a divine story that turned into historical legend and finally became the stuff of religious mythology. What really happened the first Passover morning when Moses told the Hebrews, the children of Israel, to be ready to leave in a moment's notice? Planning to hike 20 people across the desert uh, on a foot tour of sites takes weeks of preparation and meticulous planning. All Moses told the Hebrews to do was slather sheep's blood on their doorposts and lintels and be ready to head out of the promised land in the morning. But don't forget to go to your Egyptian neighbors first and tell them that you want to borrow, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, all their gold. You aren't coming back. So the word borrow is a bit of a misnomer. And what is a massive population of and what is a massive population of slaves, adding up to nearly 1.2 million people in accordance with at least the biblical accounting, doing living mixed in with their Egyptian neighbors who had gold? And if all those slaves, and if they were all slaves, why do some of them have gold? And if this is a slave community in the land of Goshen in the fertile Nile Delta region, how close are the slaves to the non-slaves? If all you have to do is walk next door and ask for a cup of yeast, oh, and all your valuables too, what power did the slave have over the common folk of Egypt that they'd just give you everything you asked for? Ah, it was the plagues. They were living in such fearful awe of you and your leader Moses that they'd give you the clothes off their backs if you asked, just to get rid of you and not suffer anymore at the hands of your God. Now, by the way, before I go forward, on the previous page, I had a map. Now, if you saw the graphic for tonight's show, I don't know if you can see that from where you're sitting now. I don't think so because you're watching the video. But if you open up another window and take a look at the graphic, or you can see it on my Facebook page, I took a map, a color map of this region. And this map is in the book because I wanted to show you a couple of things. Let me recap this. John's theory took place here in Thebes or Luxor, down here at the bottom. That loop in the Nile River, that is where Thebes sits today, current Luxor. And he believes that they went from Luxor, somehow crossed over and went across this is called the Eastern Desert, before you hit the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba and all of this down here. So if you're in Luxor and you're crossing over to the Sinai, you got to get across this desert and all the way up here somewhere to cross over. One of the spots they say it took place, they think was right here. This is actually a very biblical taking into consideration that they think it took place in Luxor. It would be down here at this narrow spot. However, I place the Exodus up here. Remember, out of, I'm looking at this backwards. There's Mennefer. Cairo is right here. It's this big area right here. And so Cairo, and just about 30 miles out of town, is Mennefer, sitting on the Nile. And Giza is out over here with the pyramids and the Sphinx and all of that. And so right here, Mennefer, I believe, is where the northern palace was. This is where Moses had his encounters with Pharaoh. Now, it says they lived in the land of Goshen, which is here in the eastern Nile Delta area, very fertile land, just east of what is present day Cairo, a little north, a little east. And right here in Goshen, right about where this N is, if you look at the graphic I put up for tonight's show, there's the city of Avaris and Pi Ramses are both right in this area. And then it's really hard to see here, especially in black and white. See where it says here in these words in the curve, the Wadi Tumalat. From the land of Goshen over here to what was known as the Bitter Lakes and the Sea of Reeds, up north of the Red Sea itself, which are still there today and were there in antiquity. The Wadi Tumalat is this fertile crescent of land that runs all the way over to the northern lakes. And this is a trade route. And this is where I believe the path that the Hebrews took from Goshen across the Wadi Tumalat to the tip of the Red Sea in what was known as the Sea of Reeds, the Bitter Lakes. And this is where I believe the crossing of the Red Sea took place, if it happened at all like we see it in Scripture. And then they came over to the Sinai and came down the Sinai, and they were over to what I believe Sarabat el Khadim, a mountain here. And by the way, once they crossed here, you come down to about here, there's the wells of Moses are here. They've been there for 3,000 years, the name place right here. And you could drive on the road down here, almost deserted. And then we go inland and you hit Sarabat el Khadim. Now, over here somewhere is St. Catherine's, the traditional Mount Sinai, where the big monastery is and all of that. I think they're digging in the wrong place, if you remember that line from Indiana Jones. So this is where I think everything took place. So that's the map I have in the book. And it's also, no, I take that back. I don't have the map on the graphic for tonight's show. I have the rear view mirror. I did a map. I redid a map specifically for that graphic tonight, and my computer crashed for some reason out of nowhere, and I lost the whole thing. And I said, screw it. I'm just going to put up a different picture. And then I used the rear view mirror picture. That's a picture I took as we were driving out of Cairo into the east of Cairo toward the Sea of the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So, all right, let's carry on with the reading. Let's see. Who else we got here? Mary, welcome. Good to see you, Mary Wins. And who else we got in here that showed up? Jeannie, good to see you. And Sue, is good to see you as well. Glad to have you in here tonight. So let's carry on. Although I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek here, and that's when I said, it was the plagues, of course. Everybody wanted them. The Egyptians just wanted them gone. And although I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek here, doesn't this make you stop and think about how it all really came down? How were the logistics carried out? Which way did they go, and what was the plan when they crossed the border with the pyramids in the rearview mirror? To some, this can sound like an adventure, but to others, this would be a veritable hell, leaving everything you knew, even as slaves, which I tend to believe more and more and more, they weren't as much slaves as they were an indentured people, a lower class because of their race, and they were Egyptianized. They were very Egyptian Hebrews. And let's see, imagine that you are so poor you don't even amount to impoverished. Your bodies are blackened by the desert sun, and the sweat of your labor stings in the wounds left by the lashes you received by your taskmaster earlier that day. The only parts of your body left without color are your mud-covered legs that were sunk into the mud pits while making bricks. Thousands and thousands of bricks every day to meet your tally, relentlessly stomping the straw and stubble into the mud to add strength to the final dried product. Imagine carrying dried brick to the boats or to the carts for transport around the country, or imagine being part of a crew that hauls blocks of quarried stones, dragging massive sandstone blocks weighing hundreds of tons. The work is hot, it's sweaty, and it's draining. And all you have to look forward to is the next day where it all begins again, all over and over and over. You are not a human being, you are a slave. The only care you receive is a commodity, a cog in the great machine that is the building power of Egypt. Imagine yourself in that position. And then there's despair. Then there is despair. There are no songs from home because this has been your home for the last several hundred years, and has been your people's home for the last 300 years. And there is nothing but hope that you will someday be freed or someday die. That's your existence, which is spoken about in Exodus 1:12 through 14, which says, "The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly." That's your existence. According to the biblical account, Moses, or Senenmut as I believe, fled Egypt after killing the taskmaster he witnessed beating a Hebrew. The passage in Exodus 1:15 tells us that when the Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. In this passage, is this passage speaking of Hatshepsut, the Pharaoh? Uh, was it she who wanted to take the life of Moses in exchange for the life of a taskmaster who was only a step above the status of a slave? Or was this taskmaster someone of greater status than the Bible tells? Rechmir, Grand Vizier of Egypt, under the reign of Tutmosis III, was someone who held great rank, but was also referred to as a taskmaster, who held the rod with which a worker would be beaten if he did not keep up with his tasks. Now, for the record, I'm not suggesting that Rechmir was the taskmaster that was killed by Moses, as he lived through the end of Tutmosis III's reign and into the reign of his successor, his son Amenhotep II. But I only cite the Grand Vizier Rechmir as an example of someone who could also literally be referred to historically as a taskmaster, albeit the one that is at the highest level or nobility over all other officials. What I'm suggesting is the possibility that Moses murdered someone who is much higher up in the chain of command, and that could be a reason he was facing pharaonic retribution. Now, keep in mind, the Old Testament, when it writes about its patriarchs, writes in apologetics. And it's also supposed to be Moses who is writing this about himself. Now, we do know the works of Moses were edited even in his day, because it speaks of his death, and it speaks of Joshua and what he was doing after the death of Moses. So we know things were added, and Joshua himself may have been the editor. But we know that there are things called apologetics in the Bible, things that are added and written and smoothed over to make the story sound better, to make the person look gooder. I didn't want to use the word better again. Sue said some people's lives are of no consideration to others. Not much changes when people decide another's life is more worthless than their own. Seems to be a human condition since way back when. Exactly. And what I had mentioned the other day when I was reading part of the Senenmut thread was that I believe there were political factions within the pharaonic court. And these factions probably was what got Moses, or I believe Senenmut, in trouble when he murdered the Egyptian taskmaster. They latched on to this. Look at politics today. Look at the way people latch on to any kind of negative story out there. Oh, it's news headline. The president was thought to have done this. Senator so-and-so has been uncovered that, he fathered three children with his maid. Things like that. Imagine in the old sense where it's, Here you've got the highest official in the land has now murdered a taskmaster, or probably somebody a little further up the chain that was taken note of during or in with the courtiers in the palace. And all of a sudden, the pharaoh wants to take his life. Now, who's the pharaoh who wants to take his life? Is it Hatshepsut? We already know that Senenmut had a love affair with Hatshepsut to the day he disappeared and she died. We also know that Tutmosis III became the next pharaoh, but was the rightful pharaoh at this time. Are they speaking to Tutmosis III, the pharaoh that sought his life? Is this the guy? This is written after the fact, remember. We don't know. Okay, enough editorializing. Let's keep moving on here. Let's see. When I'm suggesting, okay, Moses murdered someone who was much higher up the chain of command, and that it could be a reason, this could be the reason he was facing pharaonic retribution. The other reason Pharaoh was going to kill him is because this wasn't Hatshepsut at all, but the co-regent. Look, I already wrote about this, and I started talking about it. I should just shut up and read sometimes. Deposed Pharaoh Tutmosis III. When Moses, Senenmut, murdered the taskmaster, he exploited the Semitic blood of Moses as an example of what the Hebrew slaves were capable of and justified eliminating his political opponent. Again, this is speculative but highly probable under the political circumstances that existed at this time in Egypt. I'm calling it plausibility. So Moses, Senenmut, flees into hiding. He ends up in Midian, which still remains a mystery region today, but it's assumed that it's in the northeast Sinai, but some have placed it in the Sudan to the south of Egypt. It's here that Moses marries the daughter of the pagan high priest Jethro, named Zipporah. And by the way, if I don't mention it further on, the Midrash, the Jewish writings, place Moses going to Midian much later after he flees Egypt, that he first goes south to Ethiopia and marries the princess there. If you remember the story I told you, and I think it was in one of the previous books, that there is stories, ancient Jewish stories in the Midrash and the Mishnah that tell of Moses going down to subdue a rebellion in Ethiopia. He was a mighty general in the army of the Pharaoh, and his nobility brought him that position. And he ends up usurping the throne himself, taking it. Pharaoh writes a letter, sends a courier, says, "Get your ass back to Egypt. Remember, that's mine." According to the Midrash, he went down there again when he fled Egypt and took the princess to marriage. So Moses flees into hiding. He lives as a shepherd for the next 4 decades. No matter what the facts are behind the murder of the taskmaster, it's clear that Moses Senenmut is completely content with his decision to never see Egypt again. Yet Midian seems like such a close place logistically to hide out. By car, it's a handful of hours through the desert highways. By foot, however, it's weeks of travel along the ancient trade routes. After 40 years in Midian, the memories of Egypt more than likely faded to a burning picture in Moses' mind. Probably the things he could have been, the things he was, where he could have gone if he hadn't taken that step he took. But Midian was not so backwater that it would not have received news of what was happening in the world. It may not have come often, but it was sure to have reached the tents of the high priest and the sheik of Midian, who no doubt conducted trade with traveling merchants and caravans. But Moses, it seems, was oblivious to the politics back in Egypt. For when at the burning bush, he recited to God his excuse that he could return to Egypt could not return to Egypt on the account of the Pharaoh seeking to kill him there. God seemingly had to assure Moses that all who were seeking his life were dead and buried. So keep in mind, you're talking 3,500 years ago in desert countries. The news probably traveled slow, and Moses may have pretty much detached himself from it as well. I'm never one to want to explain away the miracles of the Bible. I don't like to explain those things away. It's not my place. I can offer suggestions, but I don't explain them away so much. Academia and science would have one believe that these are merely things of a faith based approach, that they're given no real credence in the search for fact. As a pragmatist and a researcher, I want to know if the entire story bears the weight of fact and is sustainable by historical evidence, and that includes the biblical passages that speak to miracles and wondrous deeds of the divine. But in so doing, to remain an out of the box thinker, I would have to come to a different conclusion regarding the deity in the biblical text. As a pragmatist, if I'm going to accept that one deity has miraculous abilities, I would have to acquiesce that other deities and other religions may also have equal abilities. So generally, the scholarly academic will sidestep the entire issue and look for a more solid answer that falls handily outside the realm of divine magics. But in this case, I think it's important to take a brief look at Moses' epiphany at the burning bush in Exodus 3 1 through 15. It says this: Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father in law, the priest of Midian, and he had led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Or in the movies, Yul Brynner, I can still hear his voice. Such a screen presence. Moses, 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 you would say. And Moses said, Here am I. I mean, what would you say, folks? If a voice came out of a burning bush and was talking to you, you'd think one of two things. One, that's it, I've gone insane. Two, heat stroke. Oh, what's my temperature? Three, is it divine? Four, is it devilish? Five, what the hell? Or what the fuck? And so, do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good, spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And boom, that's it. God introduces himself, says who he is, tells him I'm going to deliver my people because I've heard them. I'm finally going to do something about it. And so you go. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am that I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. Okay. Although at first reaction, one might be tempted to ask Moses what brand of peyote they were selling over there in Midian. It's clear that he's recording his own personal spiritual experience. He's the only one there, and no one else hears or sees what he's experiencing. I want to get into some stuff I did not include in the book because I wasn't aware of them at the time when I wrote this book. There were things I keep picking up, new things I'm learning about different things. First thing, and I do not believe I mentioned this in the book itself. Yeah, I do mention this, so I'll skip that story. I'll get it when we read the next page. But this phrase, and we've heard it, and you may have heard me talk about this before. I think I talked about it in one of the previous books where I mention the I am that's you find in this passage. Moses is asking God, so the people are going to ask me who you are and what your name is. What's your name? Now, I believe there was a little bit more to this. There was a belief, and still is, if you know the name of a deity or of some kind of spirit being, you have power over it. And so I believe, and I believe this ties into one of the 10 Commandments, which says, let's use the Old English because that's how we all learned it. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for he who does so shall not remain blameless. There's more to it than that. The thought being is this. We always thought, can't say things like, God damn it, you've taken the name of the Lord in vain. No, that's not what that is. What that passage meant and in the commandment meant taking the name of the Lord God in vain. If you go to the Hebrew, the indication here is it's the private name of God. If you use the private name of God for vain and self-fulfilling purposes, God will not hold you faultless or blameless. So the thing is, taking God's name to make yourself look better, to build yourself up, using the name of the Lord in order to do something. I think I was mentioning it had to be in the last book on the reptilians, where if you remember the prophet Elijah, when he is going down in the city and all the kids are gathering up and they're yelling at him along the road, mocking him, saying, "Go up, thou bald head. Go up, thou bald head." In other words, go up, baldy. Hey, baldy. And they're yelling at him and they're mocking him. And what does Elijah do? It says he calls on the private name of God and calls a she-bear that came charging out of the woods and sliced and diced up these kids that were mocking him. And I don't know if they ate some of them, killed some of them, maimed others. And then it says, and Elijah went on his way. And it's never mentioned again. The problem is he's inviolate of one of the commandments of God. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. It seems that he didn't like these kids mocking him. I've heard all kinds of apologetics on that passage. Oh, well, these weren't just kids and they were, of the prophets of Baal, they're kids. And it doesn't say that. It says children. And because they pissed him off and they're calling him names and mocking him, he calls a she-bear out of the woods that devours them, maims them, kills them. And he uses the private name of God to do this and goes on his merry way. There's no consequence recorded, nothing. So the first thing I want you to note is when Moses is asking, what's your name? The people are going to ask me. He's looking for a little power position. Look, I don't want to go back there. Pharaoh seeks my life. I don't want to do this. I don't, okay, if I have to go, what's your name? Tell me your name. God pretty much tells him it's none of your goddamn business what my name is. And he tells him, you tell him I am sent you. So now you got to break down the I am. Let's see. Lola Joyce's first there was sound versus the word. It's all frequency, is it not? It might be. It might be just frequency. I've heard some things about that, Lola, but I don't know for certain. I haven't researched that element so much. There are people that know more about frequency and all that than I do. But frequency, I got to tell you, ends up showing up in a lot of things. It goes from the paranormal research, supernatural stuff, religious stuff, all of that includes frequency. So you might be spot on the mark there. And you can't take the name in vain if you don't know it. Exactly, Chris. So there's something very interesting, and you may have heard me speak about this because I know for a fact I spoke about it. I don't think in the reading of this book, but in the reading of one of the previous books. This I am that is used here. God says, you tell them, I am that I am. I am that I am they speak of. And it's actually one of the rarest phrases in the original Hebrew text, in that it's a phrase that you don't see anywhere else. And it's a phrase that's an ancient Mesopotamian wordplay. And it all parses down. I did not put this in the book because I didn't know about it at this time. But it parses down to exactly the meaning from ancient Mesopotamia. Think Sumer, Akkad. We're talking 1,500 years earlier than this. Excuse me, with the Anunnaki gods and the worship of them. The phrase I am, the first I am in this, or the second I am, I think it is that word phrase that means Enki, the god Enki. Now, the god Enki in this word phrase, so in essence, what God is saying here, I am that Enki they speak of. Now, the connotation in the text doesn't tell us if he's appropriating the name for himself or if he's saying, that Enki god guy, that's who it's really me. It's not Enki. So we don't know which appropriation he's taking here. But it's interesting when you go back to the study I did in Nephilim and in reptilians, is that the ancient Mesopotamian stories of the Anunnaki were borrowed or plagiarized or included in the text that Moses wrote about Genesis. The same exact story of the Garden of Eden story got its start with the Enki and Ea story, the Elil, the chief god of the Anunnaki. Enki, known as Ea in the Sumer Akkadian culture. Enki Ea, the name Ea, later in Canaanite culture, 1,500 years later, was Ea became the base for Yahweh, which is Jehovah. And Elil, the base word El, became El in the Canaanite culture, meaning Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, all these names for God. And when you look at that, and I'm not going to get into that whole story again, but this is why I'm bringing this up here, is in the burning bush, God says, you tell them I am that Enki they speak of. And it's only a word play. It's not a direct translation. It translates into a word play that was used from Sumer Akkadian days. And he says, I'm that Enki they speak of. So if Enki, Ea, is Jehovah, and Elil is Elohim, you can see the connection that's being made there. So it's some very interesting history and very interesting linguistics. So let me move on here and read a little bit more about all this stuff. All right. There's a couple of interesting things to take note of in this passage. Now, as I mentioned previously, I'm not one to offhandedly reject the notion of miracles, nor am I one to dismiss the possibility of the divine. But those are things that create quagmires all on their own when you engage in historical research. And by the way, the mountain where we're standing is this mountain right here. It's a black and white picture. This is what John Ward and I believe is the biblical Mount Sinai. This is Serebet El Khadim. And it's actually this back here behind this front range. We had to walk all around and through this and up and back into there. And this was taken there on the site when John and I were there that afternoon when we first arrived. And this is where I believe this all took place. And in agreement, by the way, with Flinders Petrie, late 19th century, early 20th century archaeologist, anthropologist. When John Ward and I were in the Sinai in January of 2013, when I took that picture, we had the privilege and unique experience of visiting a mountain that we both believe is the holy mountain of God mentioned in the Exodus passages. We drove from Cairo straight east to the northern tip of the Red Sea, driving beneath the Suez Canal and crossing the border into Egyptian Sinai, approximating on paved highway the route the Hebrews took when leaving Egypt, which I believe began in the Delta region from the biblical land of Goshen, as I showed you on the map, the place given to the sons of Jacob, Israel, under the watchful eye of Joseph. When we turned south and followed the traditional path of the Hebrews along the eastern coastal road for about an hour, and then turned inland to the east for another hour or so. Situated there is a low mountain with a flat plateau on top. At one end of the plateau are the ancient ruins of the temple sanctuary of Hathor, the Egyptian cow goddess of joy, feminine love, and motherhood. We spent the night, and she was also, by the way, the patron god of the miners who worked the mining in that region. We spent the night as guests of Bedouin Sheikh Barakat, who put us up in one of his tattered but sturdy Bedouin tents, which I suppose was just fine for the climate. We were fed a sumptuous meal and given pillows and thick camel hair blankets to wrap up in on the cool desert floor. In the morning, we climbed to the top of Serabit el Khadim, a mountain that served as a sanctuary memorial site for the workers in the surrounding copper and turquoise mines. We also met with a guardian of the Egyptian government named Mustafa Rezik. He is a man who has archaeological authority over the entirety of the Sinai under the auspices of the Ministry of Antiquities, and hiked up with us the side of the mountain, taking us to the top. Now, it's a black and white picture, of course, in the book, but this is John and I. John, of course, way over on the left, and me on the right. And that is Sheikh Salim Barakat, and that's Serabit el Khadim in the background. This is his territory. He is the Sheikh, the Bedouin Sheikh, and he put us up in their 120-year-old family Bedouin tent that's been patchworked for years, made out of goat skins and things like that. And he fed us a fantastic meal. So there he is. That is Sheikh Barakat on that site. On the way up, the young college-aged lads. Now, this is the other thing that took place there. On the way up, the young college-aged lads who worked for Rezik walked alongside me as we neared the top. Their English was a bit rough, but we communicated just fine. We got into small talk. Imagine small talk with two guys that don't really speak each other's languages, only in bits and pieces. We got into small talk, and they humored me by calling me Great Steed. I remember one of the kids said, "You are a great steed." And for my tenacity in climbing to the top of the mountain. As a side note, these boys could have run up and down that mountain twice before I ever made it up to the top. Oh, and to be young again, I put in here. And by the way, they were wearing flip-flops and shorts and T-shirts, and I was wearing boots, hiking boots. Those kids could have climbed up and down that mountain 2 times or 3 times before I made it all the way up. And anecdotally, I don't say this in the book there, but I had pulled a tendon in my ankle the week before, or a few days before, I think it was. And so I was hobbling a little bit. And so they were saying, you are climbing mountain. You are great steed. And I think John Ward set a lot of that up too, to mock me. So anyway, here we are. As a side note, these boys could have run up and down. Yes. I asked them if they had what they meant. I asked them if they meant great stud. And they nodded their heads and said, "Yes, great steed." So I let it go at that. Language barrier. Let's see. But what happened next is the important point I want to make here. One of the boys stepped off the path and bent low. And by boys, by the way, I mean they're college boys. They're ruddy, muscular, good-looking, great shape college boys. and they're going to the university. And one of the boys stepped off the path and bent low to pick a handful of some sort of white, thorny-looking plant. He brought it to me and said, without having any idea of what we were writing our book about, and he said, "Do you know what this is?" He says, "It's a plant that's very valuable to us Bedouins." He says, "You know why?" He says, "You can light it and it never stops burning. Good for a long time." My mind, as you can probably predict before reading the next line, went directly to the burning bush passage on Exodus, a bush that burns but is not consumed. Now, as I stated, I'm not one to explain away the miracles or one religion or another, but when you can find indirect yet plausible answers to biblical miracles, it just seems to establish plausibility. Although I wouldn't mind finding proof of the miraculous, this little tidbit of information seemed to not only solidify a small part of the biblical story for me, but it seemed to have a bolstering effect on even my faith. I found myself asking if perhaps what happened to Moses was a spiritual experience that took place at a fire built of this stuff. Sure, it doesn't explain anything, nor does it add or detract from the biblical narrative, but it certainly made me consider the possibility. Now, if Moses is sitting at, and by the way, it looks like sagebush as you're walking along. It's kind of light, creamy white in color, grayish, and it's dry. But if you pick these in clumps and you twisted them together as they did, you could burn them, and they would burn for weeks, it seemed, and cast heat, so they just would not be consumed. Now, I actually have a piece here of this stuff, and I just thought of this. This is my journal that I take to Egypt with me, and I write in this, and I collect things in it, and it's all bulked out here, you see, because it's full of junk. But all I have left of this is these little twigs. This is the plant that he actually picked for me, and I've got a couple of pieces. It fell apart a bit, but I'll show it to you. These are just a couple of the fronds that came off of that dry plant that he picked. And this is the stuff, and it would grow in bundles or grow in like a sagebush, and they would take and they would bundle it all up and burn it. So I've got a piece of that in my book here, and all kinds of other stuff in here too. I used to have bulrush in here as well. I don't think I do. Oh, look what else is in there. I don't know why that's in there. Any Star Trek fans out there? Oh, that's in my book. I don't know how that got shoved in there. But here, I'll just show you this way because I'm not going to pull them out of there. Just in some of the blank pages, that's little bits of frond of Egyptian bulrush. I used to have a whole frond in here, the top of a frond. But anyway, there you go. That's that's the plant. And just a little anecdotal story there. So let me see where I left off. Right here. Let's continue on. So Moses hears God's voice, and he starts to make excuses to this presence in the burning bush disguise. Then, in a bid to find the secret name of God, which is part of many ancient cultures' spirituality, the gods have secret names, and if you can find out what they are and speak them, you can have some power over that deity. So Moses asks the question, "Whom shall I say sent me?" And God answers in a very peculiar way, "Tell them I am sent you. I am that I am." I was reading a recent article. Oh, you know what? I do have this in here. I didn't think I had this included in here. I haven't read my own book. So I was reading a recent article by Egyptologist and author David Rohl. He was writing about the Tower of Babel and made reference to Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush. He had some very interesting linguistics on this phrase, "I am that I am." I'd forgotten I added this in the book. This is from David Rohl's work. And Audrey, if you're out there, you know David Rohl very well. And he is the one, by the way, who produced the movies, the Exodus movies that he did on Moses, Patterns of Evidence. You can look him up. And he writes lots of books. Sumerian literature identifies the god who warns Gilgamesh of the impending flood as Enki. Enki's Akkadian name was Ea, pronounced Ea. The Hittites referred to him simply as Yah. If we translate the mysterious "I am who I am" of Exodus 3:14 back into Hebrew, we discover perhaps the most remarkable of all biblical plays on words. What Moses heard was Iyah Asher Iyah. The H's are silent. This does not mean I am who I am, but it can be translated as I am the one who is called Iyah. This gives a whole new meaning to God's, to God's subsequent instruction to Moses. When exiled prince of Egypt says, "Behold, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What am I to tell them?" The reply from the burning bush is, "This is what you're to say to the Israelites. Iyah, not I am. It is Iyah has sent me to you." So you see, by the way, in the English Bible, when you read "I am that I am," it says "Iyah that Iyah." In the Hebrew, it's not "I am." And Yahweh, you are to tell them, the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent you to me. Yahweh was from that moment to become the new name of the Mesopotamian deity, whose original Semitic name was Iyah. The God of the Hebrew ancestors can thus be traced back to the great Sumerian deity, whose most important title was Enki, the Lord of the Earth. How interesting is that? That's the shit, if you ask me. Moses incorporating this into his building of the Jewish religion, everything he learned in life from Egyptian to Sumerian. And here we have just learned how it was that he incorporated so much Sumerian literature into building Judaism. It was the same God that he had found in the cuneiform tablets. In a very real sense, God, in the form of the burning bush, just announced to Moses, "I am that Enki they have spoken of. That God Enki, known as Iyah, is really me. That's what you tell the children of Israel." I have maintained that when Moses left Egypt, although born of Hebrew blood, he was thoroughly Egyptian, or Egyptianized, you could say. I use the same comparison when I say that although my blood is Welsh Scot, I'm thoroughly American, as my family has lived in this land since my ancestors settled here 300 years ago. Moses brought with him all the wealth of the Egyptian royal educational system, and he combined that with everything he was to learn in Midian during the next 40 years of his life regarding the different cultures of the area and the religions of the Sinatics, the Canaanites, the Syrians, and everyone in between. Sue's, just Sub Patterns of Evidence channel. Oh, very cool. So now the return. We're on page 200, and we're going up to, what did I say? Just want to make sure we know where we are here. Going up to 217. So we got 17 pages left in the next hour. I think we can do that just fine, because I think we've already gone that many now. Let's see. Yeah, I love finding gems like that too. Gene, are you talking about real gems? Oh, and old bookstores. I see. Thrifty stores. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Empowered by his faith in God, into the courts of Pharaoh marches Moses and his older brother Aaron. Moses demands that Pharaoh let his people go. But on the way back to Egypt, we find a very odd passage in Exodus 4:21 through 26, and there's a lot of debate over what really happened here. Have you read this passage? Listen to this. It's a weird passage. The Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says: Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so he may worship me, but you refused to let him go. So I will kill your firstborn son. And at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah, his wife, took a flint knife and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time, she had said bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. That's Exodus 4:21 through 26. And so here you've got God. It says at a lot, it doesn't give you any context. It says at a lodging place on the way. So here's Moses obeying God, going back to Egypt. He's got his wife with him, his sons are with him, so on. The Lord met Moses in a lodging place along the way and was about to kill him out of nowhere. But Zipporah took the flint knife and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it, or threw it at his feet. And she said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So the Lord let him alone. Interesting. Very interesting. Because God loved him so much, says Chris. Exactly. So what was God going to kill him for? John and I debated this back and forth with each other. Not debated counterpoint, but discussed it and debated it, not knowing what the hell this passage is really talking about. I consulted several ministers and rabbinic scholars to try to find out. And everybody's got an opinion, but nobody knew exactly why, is what it came down to. This one might be best left for theological debate, but not anyone I have ever queried on this topic or this passage is sure of its direct meaning. However, the one meaning that keeps rising to the top, and it's very legalistic in nature, is that Moses had been disobedient for not circumcising his son in accordance with the law. The law, by the way, which had not been written yet. Moses is the one who wrote it. The only problem is that the law did not yet exist, as it was Moses who was to record it later. That's the excuse I got. Well, he was violating the law. He didn't circumcise his son. Well, there was no law yet. Moses was the guy who wrote it later. So apparently, according to some theologians, we are to read more into the account than what it actually tells us. And the God of the Old Testament was the kind of God that would bully those he called to follow him. I don't read anything in the passage where God, in all his glorious conversations with Moses from the burning bush, says anything to him about circumcising his son or Moses' life would be taken. That might sound a bit cynical and harsh, but if you have a better translation of the passage, we'd certainly be open to hearing about it. So we'll simply leave it at this and leave it standing as it is. It's a clearly religious issue taking place in the passage, and although it may be pertinent to the biblical story, it has little bearing at surface value to the more archaeological questions for which we're seeking answers. So I've just got to say, every time I've read that passage, I see it get skimmed over pretty quickly. And it's because we don't really know why God did what he did. We can guess and say Moses was in violation of law, but it doesn't tell us that. There's no context to this. Was this something added by the scribes later when these books were rewritten, the books of Moses, 1,000 years later? We don't know. So there's a problem passage. If you come up with something you think it is, control, says Macabre. It's a control issue. But why wouldn't God then have said to Moses? Or is it just something that's omitted from the passage, like the pharaonic names? Just, Moses didn't mention anything that happened before this, but I got to tell you, God tried to kill me at a lodging place. And my wife circumcised my son, threw it at my feet, and God let me live. So there has to be some context in there. It's between blind faith and historical scrutiny. Indeed, Joyce. Yes, he did do it to control people. Yeah. My money's on the historical lack of evidence, says Joyce. Yeah, there is lack of evidence. Audrey says it's genital mutilation. Not done in my family. There is no God, bro, says Macabre. Chris says I had no choice. Mom had it done to me when I was born. Same here. It was just part of what was done almost 60 years ago. And let's see. Howdy, everyone. Oh, hey, Breaking Dawn, Deborah L. Smith. And good to have you. And so his father said, I do not want the other boys staring at him in gym. Yeah, that's some of the reasons some are circumcised. Now, ain't so much a big deal anymore. Used to be more. Used to be an issue of medical or health, cleanliness, and things like that. I don't think we have as much problem with that anymore. So anyway, working in the OR, so many still do it. Yeah, Jeannie, I'll admit I had both of my sons circumcised. My now 18-year-old son and my now pushing 10-year-old son. My wife wasn't against it, but she said, if that's what you want to do, I probably wouldn't have done it. So both my sons are circumcised. And 10 years ago, when my son was born, I didn't have a problem with it. I have more of a problem with it now. And it's not really a problem. It's just why? Why the genital mutilation? That's some of the old biblical ways hanging on. All right, let's move on. Let my people go. Moses confronts the Pharaoh, who at this time is the son of Tutmosis III, Amenhotep II. It is not clear whether he knows who Moses is. At least the biblical passage says nothing about that. But it is not outside the realm of probability that if he knows anything about Hatshepsut, he also knows of Moses or Senenmut. As a matter of fact, it is he, Amenhotep II, who takes it upon himself to eradicate all the images of both Hatshepsut and Senenmut, her grand vizier. Could this be something he does after his encounters with Moses? After the loss of their Hebrew slaves? The timing is right, as Moses returns to Egypt only a year or two after the death of Tutmosis III, who, remember, was the stepson of Hatshepsut, who was 3 when Hatshepsut's brother died, Amenhotep II. Tutmosis II. She takes over as co-regent with the 3-year-old boy, Tutmosis III, deposes him, in a sense. She usurps the throne for herself, reigns as the Pharaoh of Egypt for the next 26 or so years. And when she dies, Tutmosis III, around 29 to 30, takes the throne. And he rules for 40 more years and then becomes co-regent with his son, Amenhotep II, for the last year or two of his reign. When Amenhotep takes over in his full right, he's about about 18 to 20 years old. And when the Exodus takes place, by the dates, he would have been about 22 or 23. So, perhaps the reappearance of Senenmut as Moses 40 years later, which was, remember, the name Hatshepsut would have given him. She gave him the name Moses, but then she renames him Senenmut later in life as she starts piling on the royal titles on a Senenmut. 40 years later spurs the young pharaoh into action against their images on the walls of Karnak and Jesher at Deir el-Bahri. Now here I am. Here's a picture of me standing. This is at Karnak Temple. This is Amenhotep II. A couple of his statues in here. And back behind here, off the picture, I just posted a picture of this, the color version, on my Facebook the other day. It's got the big obelisk of Hatshepsut is over here. So that's me standing at the base, the foot of Amenhotep II's statue. And I believe he was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So Moses and Aaron have an audience with Pharaoh, demanding he let the Israelites go free. Amenhotep II, of course, refuses, and a series of plagues are unleashed on Egypt with each successive plague. on Egypt with each successive plague. Oh, that sentence makes no sense. Pharaoh refuses with each successive plague. Now, in contrast with John, it's my belief that the entire plague scenario and Exodus took place from the Nile Delta area, up in the Memphis area, in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived in a not too distant proximity from the northern capital of Menepher. If the scriptural story bears any sort of linguistic weight, we're told that Moses came to and fro rather freely and rather quickly. If he had to traverse the 400 plus miles between Goshen and Thebes for each successive meeting with Pharaoh Amenhotep II, this process could have taken years. But as it is, the biblical accounting seems to indicate a number of weeks transpired, as opposed to months or even years. The 10 plagues is one of those stories that so smacks of religious mythology, it gets overlooked in analysis very, very easily. Some have even tried to maintain that the story is true, but just a situation where Moses relied on natural occurrence rather than divine intervention. But believing that Moses was lucky enough to have a series of strange natural occurrences all happen in a row, as well as some of the explanations concocted to describe those possible natural occurrences, takes more faith, in my opinion, to believe than simply adhering to a belief that divine power caused miraculous events to happen out of nothing. Divine magic, if you will. And there was this painting I found that I got permission to use. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave. Death of the Pharaoh's firstborn son by Lawrence Alma, painted in 1872. Much more spectacular in color, but take a look at this black and white shot. This is the death of Pharaoh's firstborn son and his grieving wife there. And this is depicted in this old painting as the 10th plague of Egypt. Now, the biblical account lists 10 plagues that befell Egypt as a result of Amenhotep's refusal to release the Hebrew slaves. 1. Water turned to blood. Exodus 7, 14 through 25. 2. Frogs. Exodus 8, 1 through 15. 3. Lice. Exodus 8, 16 through 19. 4. Flies. Exodus 8, 30 through 32. 5. Cattle disease. Exodus 9, 1 through 7. 6. Boils. Exodus, this is the first one to hit the bodies personally. Boils. Exodus 9, 8 through 12. Hail of fire was number 7. Exodus 9, 13 through 19. 8. Locusts. Exodus 10, 1 through 20. 9. Darkness. Exodus 10, 21 through 29. And then the 10th, of course, the death of the firstborn. Exodus 12, 29 through 33. There is one odd little piece of papyrus that has fallen under great scrutiny in regard to its possible linkage to the miraculous events of Exodus, and that is the Ipuwer papyrus. And then we have a section here, the Ipuwer papyrus, Ipuwer, Ipuwer papyrus. This much disputed artifact is a single papyrus containing an ancient Egyptian poem called The Admonitions of Ipuwer, or the Dialogue of Ipuwer and the Lord of All. The papyrus is both unique and under debate because it so closely resembles the events associated with the biblical story of the 10 plagues, and when anything gets close to looking too biblical, it's going to fall under much scrutiny. In the story, we are told of chaos in Egypt, of the world turning upside down, of warfare, famine, death, and poverty, and of a world where the servants and slaves run free and rebellion ensues. The date of the poem remains completely unknown, but one surviving copy that still exists is a copy that dates back to the 13th century BC, no later than the 19th dynasty. We're talking about all these events had taken place in the 18th dynasty, about 100 years before. But the poem is thought to be much older. The papyrus contains some startling similarities to the Exodus account. Papyrus 2:10 says the river is blood. Exodus 7:20, all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. Papyrus 4:14 and 6:1, trees are destroyed, no fruit nor herbs are found. Exodus 9:25, and the hail smote every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. All right. Papyrus 3:10 or 2:10, forsooth gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. Exodus 9:23 through 24, the fire ran along the ground. There was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous. Papyrus 9:11, the land is not light. Exodus 10:22, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt. Papyrus 4:3, 5, 6, and 6:12, forsooth the children of princes are dashed against the walls. Forsooth the children of princes are cast out in the streets. Exodus 12:29 says, and it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne, unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon. As you can imagine, the Egyptologists and archaeologists had a field day with this papyrus, and the various theories range from the papyrus describing the conditions of the Egyptians while under the northern dominion of the Hyksos, to parts of the papyrus thought to be addressing the pharaoh Keti of the 13th dynasty, and the admonitions contained therein as addressing the god Etam, not a single human king. The likelihood that this particular document is an actual accounting of the plagues that would have befallen Egypt under the reign of Amenhotep II in the year 1445 or 46 BC is probably unlikely, and the biblical account is more than likely the only surviving account of what happened, so it has to remain in the realm of biblical myth as opposed to verifiable fact. There is no direct evidence and scarcely any secondary archaeological evidence for the present. The Apur papyrus, by the way, has been much vaunted by the UFO community in that they take certain events listed in the document, rings of fire that appear in the sky, and attribute them to their own brand of ufological mystery. So if you're a believer in scripture and or a believer in UFO phenomenon, this is your document. But there is no evidence that it is anything other than a legendary poem out of Egyptian antiquity. Now, Grand Vizier Rechmeyer is the next section. There is, however, an interesting theory regarding the pharaoh who presided during the period of the 10 plagues, and this is put forward in The Secret of Qumran by B.P. Bendedik. It is Bendedik's contention that the pharaoh of the Exodus is not really the pharaoh at all. And we talked about this once before. But the representative of the pharaoh, as in his grand vizier, who is the pharaoh pro tempore in his absence. He places the plagues in the Exodus under the reign of Amenhotep II, but contends that Amenhotep II was away, campaigning at war during the time of the plagues and the release of the Hebrew slaves. And when he returns, his wrath falls squarely on the shoulders of his old grand vizier, Rechmir. Now remember, I told you that Tutmosis III reigned as co-regent with his young son, who was 18 at the time, Amenhotep II, and within 2 years was dead, and Amenhotep II took over in his own right. And the Exodus date that I've set has him at about 22 to 23 years old. But prior to that date of 1446, he would have conducted at least 5 successful military campaigns away from Egypt. He was on campaign. So, the cornerstone to this theory rests on a literal interpretation of the Song of Moses and Miriam, found in Exodus 15, 1 through 21. This is the same Miriam that John had played the tambourine, just like Sitamun, who he believes was the older sister of Moses. If the individual lines are taken literally, the song tells of how the Pharaoh and his chariots were all buried in the closing walls of the parted Red Sea, and how they all drowned. The problem is that if Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, he lived past the date of the Exodus and ruled for another 29 years. Now, here it is. Shirat Hayom, the Song of the Sea, also known as the Song of Moses and Miriam. And Miriam is the one who sings this. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths of stone, like stone. Your right hand, Lord, has majestic power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. Think of this in poetic sense. This is Hebrew translated to English, so it's going to be clunkier. But in the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the water piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them, I will draw my sword in my hand, will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? It's an interesting phrase. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia, of all nations. I don't know why they're mentioned. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them by the power of your arm. They will be as still as a stone until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you brought pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. The Lord reigns forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went down into the sea, and the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed with her, and to timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. Bendetic speaks a bit conspiratorially when he suggests that a dating system known as the King's Calendar is really an obfuscated calendar meant to conceal the true history of Israel. He says this, the King's Calendar position is not that such people, but rather the biblical records are in fact reliable historical documents. They do nevertheless contain errors, and more importantly, as the King's Calendar research demonstrates, contain a chronology that was designed to conceal the exact and true chronological history of Israel. In demonstrating that the Exodus occurred in the 18th Egyptian dynasty, 15th century BCE, the King's Calendar computer generated mathematical calendar indicates that Mosaic Exodus occurred in 1449 BC, with the Israelites crossing over into Canaan in 1412 BC. Traditional dating for the 18th Egyptian dynasty, although academics have yet to agree with each other, definitively indicates that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was either Tutmosis III or Amenhotep II. The king's calendar demonstrates that it was Pharaoh Amenhotep II. As he did not die in any crossing of the Red Sea, a challenge itself to biblical infallibility, some explanation must be found for the Israelites rejoicing at Pharaoh's demise in the Red Sea. But does the Bible actually say that Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea? This was all the writings of Rabbi Ben Dedek. Now, the main premise of this theory is that Pharaoh Amenhotep II, out on campaign, leaves Grand Vizier Rechmir in charge, who has the power to be Pharaoh in Amenhotep's absence, much like Joseph wielded the power of the Pharaoh when he was the Grand Vizier of Egypt. Rechmir had been the Grand Vizier and in the service to the father of Amenhotep, Tutmosis II, for 54 years. I'm sorry, that's Tutmosis III. There's a typo in my book. He had been in service to the father of Amenhotep, Tutmosis III. I have the second there. Damn it! For 54 years, and was well established as a counselor to the pharaohs. Of course, Amenhotep, the young, boisterous, egotistical, wrathful pharaoh that he was known to be, would just as soon clean out the cupboards and build everything new in his own image and under his own hand. So Rechmir, whether a victim of the close personal wrath of Amenhotep or as the pharaoh is sent by Amenhotep to pursue the fleeing slaves, found a bitter end to his otherwise glorious and lengthy career. His death is a mystery, but it's suspected that he fell out of favor for some disgrace, and this precipitated an unnatural demise at the hands of Pharaoh Amenhotep II, who, remember, was about 23 years old, brash, egotistical, wrathful, warrior-like, etc. According to this theory, Grand Vizier Rechmir is actually the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who was not really the Pharaoh. It seems that Amenhotep II had no idea the Hebrews had left, and had to be in few biblical passages in Exodus illustrate this point. Listen to this, Exodus 14, 5 through 12. When the king of Egypt, now get this, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? Have we let the Israelites go and have lost their services?" So he had his chariots made ready and took the army with him, and took 600 of the best chariots along with all other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of king of Egypt so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's chariots, horsemen, and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Hahir, opposite Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Amenhotep II was also concerned that the Exodus may have been procured by the use of magic arts, as indicated in Josephus's Antiquities 2:15-3. It says here, Josephus wrote, "But the Egyptians soon repented that the Hebrews were gone. And the king also was mightily concerned that this had been procured by the magic arts of Moses. So they resolved to go after them." But also, according to Josephus, the Hebrews, nearly 1.2 million in number, fleeing Egypt, were pursued by Pharaoh's army. That was 600 chariots, 50,000 horsemen, and 250,000 foot soldiers, all armed. So roughly 300,600 soldiers strong was Pharaoh's army that pursued the escaping Hebrews. That's quite a horde. And they all supposedly bottlenecked at the Red Sea. It seems to me that these biblical and ancient historical documents have a way with distorting numbers, but that's not to say that the event did not take place at all. Now, the crossing of the Sea of Reeds. There is no historical data to lend any archaeological or historical veracity to this biblical account, other than the pages of Scripture itself. What we do know is that the Hebrews did not cross at the wide expanse of the Red Sea, but rather at a place referred to as the Yam Suf, most probably identified with the Lake Timsah region, a few miles to the north end of the Red Sea, when in reality it says the Reed Sea or the Sea of Reeds. This is a region just north of the Red Sea where the waters flow into salt lakes, but it's very shallow and could easily be crossed on foot. If you're open to miracles, then anything's possible. The Hebrews would have come to the lake or to the larger expanse, even of the Red Sea, and God would have parted the waters and closed them up on the pursuing Egyptian army of 300,600 soldiers, because the passage says they were all drowned in the closing of the sea. However, there are other possibilities, in that the Sea of Reeds was passable by foot, and it has long been an observable event that sometimes in the spring and summer, strong winds can dry portions of the shallow lake, and you walk across on the dried out bottom of the lake. The biblical passage tells us that Moses stretched his staff over the waters, and that a strong east wind blew all night and parted the waters. Read this dramatic passage from Exodus. Now, this is a long passage, but here's the story. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Don't be afraid, stand firm, and you'll see the deliverance of the Lord that he will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Shut up. Hashtag be still. Hashtag shut up. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" Listen, here's the God. It just amazes me. God who knows everything, omnipresent, omniscient, the God who sent him. And he's saying to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stretched behind and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them. All the Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let us get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and it divided, or I'm sorry, at daybreak, and the sea went back to its place. I'm sorry, I've got my phone ringing. I forgot to turn it off. My apologies, guys. So I'm going to turn that off right now, so we're not so rudely interrupted again. I had that happen once when I was speaking at an event. There'd be about 400 people out in the audience, and my phone rang. And I answered it, and I said, "Hey, folks, here we go. Hello?" And it was my friend Dave Potter. And Dave said, "Hey, how you doing, man?" I go, "Well, I'm speaking at this event. Hey, folks, everybody, say hi to my friend Dave." And I held up my phone, and the whole audience said, "Hello, Dave," just like that. He laughed on the other end. He says, "I'll call you back later." Anyway, so at daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Our ultimate goal here is to attempt to find plausible historical evidence for these events. When we're in the palaces of Egypt, this is much easier as we can focus on people and places. But when you get to deciphering things that are miraculous events that might be able to be explained by natural occurrences, you might end up with plausibility. But what does that do to the faith element of the tale? To suggest that 1.2 million fleeing slaves, plus another 300,600 Egyptian soldiers with 600 chariots and 50,000 horses, all entered the Sea of Reeds in one single night, you're stretching not only the bounds of imagination, but also the limits of physics. So I think there's something skewed in the numbers there, or the story itself is just simply not true. I think there's truth to the story, so I think that the numbers are a little exaggerated there. I want to tell you this event that talks about the strong east wind blowing out of the east. This is a recorded natural occurrence. It's a geologic event. And the wind blows out of the Negev, which is south of Israel, in between Israel and the Sinai. And it blows, and it has the effect of rendering these bitter lakes, the Sea of Reeds especially. It can blow back the waters and dry off the ground because it's a shallow lake. The problem is when the wind stops suddenly, the waters will come rushing back in like a tsunami. And you don't want to be anywhere in its path. Now, while this is a smaller lake than the expanse of the Red Sea, you're still looking at something that's at least a couple miles in expanse across, if not more. You're talking like a Minnesota lake or something like that. So when this water is parted, it has the ability to drown people if you're stuck out there in the middle. You don't want to be there when the water rolls back in. So it's maybe on a little more grandiose scale, but if you take a look at the movie, the Ridley Scott movie, Exodus, Gods and Kings, spectacular parting of the Red Sea story. And you just have to watch it. It's pretty well done. And I think it's probably a little closer than, say, the Charlton Heston movie in the 50s, Cecil B. DeMille. Let's see. I'm looking at some of the things. At my age, the spirit is willing, the flesh won't get up out of the bed. Joyce, you and me both. Let's see. Let's see. Chris, in all lies is a nugget of truth. As in all truth, there's a small nugget of a lie. As one of my seminary professors told me, Chris, he said, all mythology has at its headwaters a kernel of truth. And I know Japanese. I don't know what I said. I'm active. I have to be busy. I like to be outside, though, says Jeannie. A lot of truth in the good book, but the deal is it's all a myth, an allegory for a greater truth, says Joyce. I would only add to that, Joyce, that I think the historical events are spot on. There's efficacious history there. I think the faith stories are telling stories for the purpose of bolstering the faithful. So if there indeed was an escape from Egypt, if there indeed was a crossing of the sea, uh, how do we know it happened the way it is, except by faith? It's a faith story. So, but there are geological events, natural occurrences that tell us some of these things are plausible, which is a good thing. So, anyway, girl with no name, need your number, sir. I don't know if you're talking to me. If you are, I will send it on to you. You can find it on my website too. Let's see, the Holy Mountain of God. After the successful crossing of the sea, I am inebriated, but I need guidance. Okay. That's like arguing with a liberal. I'm kidding. I'm kidding, folks. You know my politics. Brush it off. It's a joke. After the successful crossing of the Sea of Reeds, the Hebrews head south to avoid the Philistines to the north. The easiest passage would be to turn north and walk across the northern Negev, right into what is southern Israel today. But instead, they turned south and they marched down the eastern shore of the Red Sea. Of course, it's been established that there existed at this time a line of Egyptian forts along the Negev at the north of the Sinai Peninsula. Turning north would have run the Hebrews directly into several defensive stations of the Egyptian army, who were probably already on the alert for them. So the Hebrews turn south and veer inland on what is now the approximate area of the seaside town of Abu Zanima, and travel about 25 miles to a mountain known as Serebet el Khadim. And by the way, those who have disagreed with us, saying Serebet el Khadim is the holy mountain of God, the Mount Sinai, have said that there were other mountains and other places that the Israelites passed by on the way to and released slaves that joined them in the Exodus. And they think that Serebet el Khadim is one of those places where the copper mines all were and the turquoise mines. So atop this mountain lay the ruins of the temple sanctuary of Hathor, the cow goddess of Egypt, bringer of joy and motherly love. Sir Flinders Petrie was a British Egyptologist and pioneer of systematic methodology in archaeology and the preservation of historical artifacts. He was also the first chair of Egyptology in Great Britain and personally excavated and cataloged many of the most important archaeological sites in Egypt. It was his contention that Serebet el Khadim was the holy mountain of God, mentioned throughout the biblical Exodus account. But he encountered resistance when he suggested that Moses went there to visit the priests who lived there rather than encounter the presence of God. So Serebet el Khadim was scratched off the list as a candidate for the biblical Mount Sinai by many late 19th and early 20th century archaeologists and historians. And by the way, it's very hard to see here again. It's in the book. But this is Serebet el Khadim. That back there in the background, this is at the top of the mountain, this plateau. And these are the temples of Hathor and Ptah. They're little caves up there. And all of this rubble coming all the way out to the main gate is all the pharaohs for 1,500 years built successive little chambers, about the size, think of the size of a single car garage, coming out from the caves all the way out to what was left and became the main entrance to the area. So this is all on the top of the mountain there. All right. Here we go. Let's see. As I began to account at the beginning of this chapter, John and I climbed to the top of Serebet el Khadim, and we walked the escarpment surrounded by the haze of Sinaitic mountain peaks all around us. The sun was shining, but there was the continual rising mist of dust and blowing sand that cast the entire mountaintop in filtered light even at midday. The place had a calm, almost melancholic enchantment with a decidedly ethereal feel. Above all else, it was incredibly quiet. As we cleared a small hillock and saw the ruins of Hathor's temple at the far end of the escarpment, The ruins were magnificent in their decay. Obvious signs of earthquake were all around the debris. The mountain was obviously not always this quiet. Though John and I bring differing views of who Moses was and when the events of the Exodus took place, we both agree that lonely, desolate, remote mountaintop was the place where Moses climbed to visit the priests of Hathor and ritually cleanse himself as he had done here at other times in his former life as a prince of Egypt. It was here on this mountaintop that he carved the small stelae of tablets of the law and carried them back down to the waiting horde of Hebrews camped in the basin and wadis below, who had built a representation of the God who had just a week earlier delivered them from the hands of the Egyptian soldiers. Hathor, the Egyptian god of joy, feminine love, motherhood, and patron saint to the miners, here in this mountainous region of the Sinai Desert wilderness, surrounded by copper and turquoise mines, she was the patron god of miners. Moses was apoplectic when he learned that the people he had just led out of Egypt in the name of Yahweh, the new God who revealed himself to Moses through the fires of the burning bush that was not consumed, were so soon reverted back to their Egyptian ways and their Egyptian understanding of God. As a result, Moses dealt with them harshly in Exodus 32:15 through 35. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, so he must have been up there with Moses, he said to Moses, "There's a sound of war in the camp." Moses replied, "It's not the sound of victory. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear." When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf the people had made and burned it in the fire. Then he ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. He said to Aaron, "What did these people do to you that you led them into such a great sin?" "Do not be angry, my lord." This is his brother. Aaron answered, "You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us, as this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt. We don't know what's happened to him.' So I told them, 'Whatever has any gold jewelry, take it off, whoever.' And then they gave me the gold and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Duh. Moses saw that the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control, and so became a laughing stock to their enemies. I don't know who all was watching this, but there it is. So he stood at the entrance to the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the Levites rallied to him. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. Then Moses said, "You have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day." The next day Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold, but now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." The Lord replied to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin." And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did and the calf Aaron had made. Let me take a drink here. And this is the cyclical story that continues to repeat and repeat and repeat all through the next 40 years as the Hebrews wander the desert wilderness of the Sinai. And it's not until the entire generation dies off that they're allowed to enter the land of promise, with the exception of two guys, Joshua and Caleb, who were old dudes by this time. I have often wondered how a Semitic slave people, whom we've learned through our various synagogue and church teachings, were a people of God, could so soon and so quickly turn to idol worship after having experienced such wondrous acts of their God. They saw the devastation that the plagues took on the Egyptians, and yet not on them. They slathered and swiped their doorposts and lintels with sheep's blood to save off the plague against the firstborn, and they saw miraculous deliverance. They found themselves trapped up against the waters of the sea, with Pharaoh's armies closing down on them, yet were once again delivered by the miraculous hand of the divine, who sent a cloudy pillar of fog and fire and opened the waters of the sea so they could cross on dry ground. They experienced the wonders of their God right before their very eyes. And yet, just a few short weeks later, while Moses was atop the mountain, they needed a physical representation of that God, saying, "We don't know what's happened to this man, Moses, who led us out of Egypt. Where'd he go?" And Aaron, Moses' brother, told them to turn over all the gold they had plundered from the Egyptians, and he cast a golden calf and sculpted it with the engraver's tools. The people all responded, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from Egypt." How could they so readily abandon this God of Moses? The answer is that perhaps they didn't. They were simply a product of their environment. They were not a people of Jehovah. They were descendants of a Canaanite family that had, throughout the past 400 years, been thoroughly assimilated into Egyptian culture. Even as slaves, they were completely Egyptianized, and the building of the golden calf is simply a clue as to who these people really were and how Egyptian they had become as a people group. Perhaps Moses, Senenmut, was a man bent on nation building. He had fled Egypt 40 years earlier, the facts of which are lost in antiquity, save for the account in the biblical passages. And we already know how these texts can lose historical reliability in light of their editing and faith based presentation. Again, this is not to say that the biblical passages are false or manufactured, but that they have obviously shown us that a keen eye to the historical details was deemed as unnecessary to their overall theme of bolstering the faithful and building a history for the nation of Israel. Perhaps Moses did indeed murder an Egyptian taskmaster, precipitating his flight from Egypt and the wrath of the Pharaoh, who sought to take his life. But as mentioned earlier, there's probably much more to this scenario than the biblical account mentions. Senenmut, royal architect under Pharaoh Hatshepsut, most certainly had continual contact with the builders, workers, overseers, and taskmasters associated with his projects. Was there some devastatingly a heinous encounter he had with one of the overseers? Was this something that launched a political move from Tutmosis III? Could this be the source of Senenmut's disappearance from Egyptian history? And only after 40 years hiding in the Sinaitic wilderness did Senenmut return, when his old rival Tutmosis III had died and left his son Amenhotep II on the throne. And perhaps this very act of Senenmut's return and the great exodus was the very sparking point of Amenhotep's rageful eradication of not only Hatshepsut, but her Grand Vizier, hereditary crown prince Senenmut, from the walls of Egypt's temples and monuments. And that's the end of chapter 10. And tomorrow we're going to get back to the Hapu thread, John's writings, chapter 11, the wilderness. So there you have it, folks. I think, and I'm convinced more and more, the more I read and study and research and think about these things, that despite having only 6 minutes, 5 minutes until I go live with Rocky and Scott Walter, that there is efficacy to the biblical history. And I think it's displayed in Senenmut. And so we can just stick with Senenmut, says Audrey. There you go. Chris, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, don't forget to go to my website. Go check things out. Fine china plate with Lilith painted Chinese. That's cool, Jeannie. And so there you go, folks. That's the reading for tonight. I'd like to say more. I could talk more and more and more about this, but that lengthy chapter took us almost exactly 2 hours. And what I got to go do right now is get a cup of coffee, go splash water on my face, and be ready for an hour with Rocky Stucci and Scott Walter. Go over to Rocky's channel. We'll see you there in about 4 minutes. Thanks for being here. You don't know how much I appreciate you. I love you all. Thank you very much. Good night.